A good man was about to hang for stealing food for his starving children. The rope was around his neck. But his salvation would come from the most unexpected person in town. The pregnant widow of the late sheriff, who made a choice that would either save them all or ruin them forever. This is their story. Elias Thorne stood on the gallows, the rough hemp of the noose scratching against his neck. He was not a thief. He was a carpenter, a mountain man, a father. But a brutal winter had stolen his work, and a fever had stolen his wife, leaving him with 2 small children and an empty larder. For weeks, he had swallowed his pride, begging for credit, for work, for anything to feed his son and daughter. But pride doesn't fill empty bellies. One desperate night, he had broken into the town smokehouse and taken a single sack of flour and a side of bacon. He was caught before he even made it home. Now, he stood before the entire town of Purgatory Peak, a name that had never felt so fitting. He didn't look at the crowd, their faces a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. He didn't look at the executioner. His eyes were fixed on his 2 children, Caleb and Lily, who were being held back by a kind neighbor. They were crying, their small faces streaked with tears and dirt, their hands reaching for him. The sight of their terror was a punishment far worse than the rope. He closed his eyes, his only prayer that someone, anyone, would care for them after he was gone. On a raised platform beside the gallows sat Judge Miller, a man whose heart was as hard as the granite of the mountains. He saw the world in black and white, in law and chaos. To him, Elias's desperation was not a mitigating circumstance. It was a symptom of a moral decay that had to be cut out, like a cancer. He had made this hanging a public spectacle, a grim lesson for anyone else who dared to step out of line. He ignored the murmurs of the crowd, the pleas for mercy. The law, he declared, his voice booming across the square, was absolute. From the edge of the crowd, Sarah Jenkins watched, her hand resting protectively on her swollen, pregnant belly. As the widow of the late, beloved Sheriff Jenkins, she held a place of respect in the town. She knew Elias Thorne. Her husband had spoken of him as an honest, hard-working man. She also knew Judge Miller and his rigid, unforgiving brand of justice, a stark contrast to her husband's belief and compassion. She saw the crying children, and her heart, already heavy with her own grief, broke for them. To orphan 2 more children in the name of a stolen sack of flour was not justice. It was cruelty. As the executioner placed a black hood over Elias's head, something inside Sarah snapped. She could not stand by and watch this happen. It was a betrayal of everything her husband had stood for. Pushing her way through the stunned crowd, she marched towards the gallows. The judge's eyes narrowed, annoyed by the interruption. He ordered her to step back, but Sarah did not falter. She stood before him, her voice ringing with a strength and authority no one expected from the grieving widow. She did not plead for mercy. She invoked the law. She spoke of an old, almost forgotten statute from the territory's founding days, a pledge law, designed for harsh winters when good men were forced into desperate acts. The law stated that any citizen of proven good standing could claim the debt and servitude of a condemned man, taking full responsibility for his actions and labor, thereby satisfying the law's demand for punishment while sparing a life. A stunned silence fell over the town square. Judge Miller's face turned purple with rage. He knew the law. He, the great interpreter of statutes, was being cornered by a forgotten paragraph. He tried to argue, to declare the law archaic, but the town's elders, their own consciences pricked by Sarah's courage, began to murmur their agreement. The law was the law. Bound by the very rigidity he championed, the judge was trapped. With a snarl of fury, he was forced to agree. Sarah Jenkins, the pregnant widow, would take responsibility for the thief, Elias Thorne. Her farm would pay the debt to the store, and he would be her bonded servant until the debt was worked off. As the executioner removed the noose from his neck, Elias opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was not the face of his executioner, but the determined, courageous face of the sheriff's widow, a woman he barely knew, who had just gambled her own reputation to save his life. He didn't understand why, but as he was led off the gallows, not to his death, but towards her small homestead at the edge of town, he knew he had just been given a second chance. a debt that would take a lifetime to repay. The journey from the gallows to Sarah Jenkins's homestead was the longest walk of Elias Thorne's life. He was a free man, yet he had never felt more like a prisoner. He was now a bonded servant, his life and labor owned by the pregnant widow of the town's most respected man. The gratitude he felt was immense, a crushing weight that sat alongside a deep, burning shame. He, a proud mountain man who had always provided for his own, was now a charity case, a living symbol of failure. Sarah's farm was a stark contrast to his own rugged life in the mountains. It was small, orderly, with neat rows of winter vegetables and a sturdy, well-mended fence. It was a place of quiet dignity. She showed him to a small, clean room in the barn, a space clearly prepared for a hired hand, not a condemned man. She explained his duties, mending the fence, chopping firewood, tending the livestock, her tone polite but distant. She was his savior, but she was also a stranger. His children, Caleb and Lily, were shadows of their former selves. Traumatized by the events at the gallows, they clung to their father, refusing to speak, their eyes wide with a fear that never seemed to leave them. They looked at Sarah, not with gratitude, but with the deep suspicion of children who had just seen the world at its cruelest. The first few weeks were a study in awkward silence. Elias worked with a relentless, punishing intensity from before sunrise to long after sunset. He was trying to work off his debt, to erase his shame with sweat and exhaustion. He ate his meals alone in the barn, refusing to sit at her table, unable to meet her eyes. Sarah, in turn, kept her distance, giving him the space he seemed to need. She was dealing with her own battle. The town, which had once looked at her with pity and respect, now whispered behind her back. They called her a fool, a bleeding heart who had brought a dangerous thief into her home, risking her own safety and that of her unborn child. She ignored them, her resolve as steady as the mountains that watched over the town. The first crack in the wall of silence and shame came not from the adults but from the children. One cold evening, as Elias worked late repairing a broken wagon wheel, Sarah saw Caleb and Lily huddled by the barn door, shivering in the cold, waiting for their father. They were hungry, but too afraid to ask for food. Seeing their small, miserable faces, Sarah's heart ached. She walked out to them, not with pity, but with a quiet, maternal warmth. She knelt down, her swollen belly making the movement awkward, and offered them each a freshly baked molasses cookie, still warm from the oven. The children stared at the offering, then at her, their eyes wide. "Your father is a good man, working hard for you. You must be proud of him. It's all right to be hungry. Come inside." She led them into her warm kitchen and set 2 large bowls of hot stew on the table. She didn't press them to talk. She just sat with them, a quiet, reassuring presence as they ate. From the barn, Elias watched the scene through a crack in the wall. He saw his children, for the first time in weeks, begin to relax. He saw them finish their meal and look at Sarah, not with fear, but with a dawning sense of wonder. He saw a kindness so pure and unconditional, it brought a lump to his throat. She was not just fulfilling a legal obligation. She was caring for his children as if they were her own. That night, for the first time, Elias knocked on her kitchen door. He didn't come to eat. He came to speak, his voice a low, rough whisper. "Thank you, Mrs. Jenkins. For the children. A child's hunger is no crime, Mr. Thorne." It was a small exchange, but it changed everything. The next day, he took his meals at her kitchen table. The silence was still there, but it was no longer a silence of shame, but one of quiet, mutual respect. He began to see past the sheriff's widow and saw a woman of immense courage and a quiet strength that rivaled his own. She, in turn, began to see past the bonded thief and saw a proud, honorable father who had been driven to a desperate act by love. He started leaving small, carved animals by his children's bedsides, a silent gift that also felt like a gift to her. She, in turn, started leaving a hot flask of coffee for him by the barn door in the cold mornings. They were 2 broken families, 2 single parents navigating an impossible situation, who were slowly, cautiously, beginning to find in each other an unexpected ally in the lonely war of survival. As the awkwardness of their arrangement gave way to a quiet routine, the homestead began to feel less like a place of legal obligation and more like a shared sanctuary. Elias's children, Caleb and Lily, no longer hid in their father's shadow. Emboldened by Sarah's gentle kindness, they began to explore their new home. They would follow her as she fed the chickens, their small voices filling the air with questions she was happy to answer. They discovered the joy of her stories, tales of her own childhood that she would read to them on the porch in the evenings. For the first time since their mother's death, they were simply allowed to be children. Elias watched this transformation with a heart full of a gratitude so profound it was almost painful. He worked with a renewed purpose, his strength not just paying a debt, but actively contributing to the well-being of the woman who had saved them. He repaired the sagging porch, built a new, stronger gate for the pasture, and his expert carpentry was evident in every corner of the farm. He and Sarah spoke more now, their conversations moving from polite practicalities to shared observations about the weather, the farm, and the children. It was a fragile, budding friendship, built on a foundation of shared responsibility. But the harshness of the frontier is never far away. The late autumn brought a biting, damp cold that seemed to settle deep in the bones. One morning, Elias's daughter, Lily, woke with a fever. By midday, a dry, rattling cough had taken hold of her small body, a sound that sent a chill of pure terror down Elias's spine. It was the same cough that had preceded his wife's death. Panic seized him. He immediately went to fetch the town doctor, a man he had known for years. But when he explained the situation, Dr. Miller shook his head, his eyes cold and unforgiving. Influenced by Judge Miller's harsh stance, he refused to come. She is the child of a convicted thief, living in an unseemly household. I will not risk my reputation by associating with such matters. Find your own remedies, Thorne. Elias returned to the farm, defeated and desperate. Lily's fever was climbing, her breathing becoming shallow and ragged. He felt a helplessness he hadn't known even on the gallows. His strength was useless against the sickness that was stealing his daughter. He could only sit by her bedside, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, his heart breaking with every weak cough. It was then that Sarah entered the room. She was no longer the calm, distant mistress of the house. Her face was set with a fierce, maternal determination. She had seen this before. She had lost a husband to the violence of men, but she would not lose this child to the indifference of them. Go, boil water, keep the fire hot, and bring me my husband's old medicine bag from the chest. For the next 2 days and nights, they fought for Lily's life together. The line between them of savior and saved, of mistress and bonded servant vanished completely. They were simply two parents, united in a shared, terrifying fear. Sarah took charge, her knowledge of herbal remedies, passed down from her mother and honed by her late husband, becoming their only weapon. She brewed teas from willow bark to fight the fever and made poultices of melon to ease the cough. Elias became her hands. He followed her instructions without question, grinding herbs, keeping the compresses cool, and using his immense strength to gently hold Lily as Sarah forced spoonfuls of bitter medicine past her lips. He watched in awe as this pregnant woman, who should have been resting, worked tirelessly, her energy seeming to come from a bottomless well of sheer force of will. On the morning of the third day, the fever broke. Lily woke, weak but lucid, her breathing clear for the first time in days. The crisis had passed. Elias and Sarah stood by the bed, looking down at the sleeping child, their faces etched with exhaustion, but their eyes shining with a shared, profound relief. He turned to her, his voice thick with an emotion that stripped away all his pride, all his shame. You saved her. We saved her. And in that moment, in the quiet of the sick room, looking at each other over the sleeping form of the child they had fought for together, they were no longer a widow and a thief. They were a family. The shared fear had burned away the last of their awkwardness, forging a bond of trust and intimacy that was stronger and more real than any legal document or town gossip. Lily's recovery changed the very air they breathed. The last vestiges of formality between Elias and Sarah dissolve, replaced by a comfortable, easy partnership. They were a team, a well-oiled machine, running the farm and raising the children together. Elias, no longer burdened by shame, began to laugh again. His deep, rumbling laughter, a sound that filled the house with a joy it hadn't known in years. And Sarah, watching him play with his children, felt her own heart, long dormant, begin to beat with a new and unfamiliar rhythm. She was falling in love with the good, honorable man she had saved from the gallows. But their newfound peace was a fragile thing, a single candle flickering in a gathering storm. They knew Judge Miller was not a man to be defied. He was biding his time, waiting for an opportunity to reassert his authority and punish the woman who had publicly humiliated him. The warning came, as it often did, from the town's quiet network of decent folk. The preacher, a kind man troubled by the judge's increasing tyranny, made a special trip out to their homestead. He sat at their kitchen table, his face grave, and told them a story from 5 years prior. Before Judge Miller was the unchallengeable authority he was today, he had been involved in a corrupt scheme with a railroad company to seize land from local ranchers through legal trickery. The one man who had the courage to stand up to him, who meticulously gathered evidence and exposed the scheme in a territorial hearing, was the town's then sheriff, Sarah's late husband, John Jenkins. The plot twist was devastating. The judge was not just censured, he was publicly shamed and lost a great deal of money. He never forgave the sheriff. He had harbored a deep, poisonous grudge for years, waiting for a chance to exact his revenge on the legacy of the man who had bested him. Elias's theft had been the perfect opportunity. The judge's merciless pursuit was never about a sack of flour. It was a cruel, calculated attempt to destroy the family of his old enemy. By making Elias hang, he would have proven the town was better off without the sheriff's brand of compassion. And by saving him, Sarah had not only defied the law in his eyes, she had once again made a fool of him, just as her husband had done. This was no longer about justice. It was a personal vendetta. And the preacher warned them. The judge would not rest until he had crushed them and everything the Jenkins name stood for. The judge's attack came 2 weeks later, and it was as cunning as it was cruel. He didn't come for Elias. He came for Sarah. He arrived at the homestead, not with a mob, but with a single, smirking lawyer and a legal document. He had spent weeks combing through the town's records. He had found a forgotten civic bond, a loan her husband had taken out years ago to help fund the construction of a new town bridge. It was a debt of honor, to be paid back over many years. But the judge, using his authority, had called the entire bond due immediately, demanding a sum so large he knew Sarah could never pay it. He gave her 1 week to produce the money, or the farmer husband's legacy would be seized and auctioned off to settle the debt. It was a perfect legal trap. He had found a way to ruin her, to destroy her husband's name, and to punish Elias by taking away the very home that had given him a second chance. Despair, cold and absolute, settled over Sarah. She had fought for Elias, but she did not know how to fight this. But she was not alone anymore. That night, as she sat staring at the foreclosure notice, Elias sat beside her. He was no longer her bonded servant. He was her partner. He looked at the impossible sum on the paper, then at the town's name on the letterhead, and then a slow, determined fire began to burn in his eyes. He was a carpenter, a master craftsman, and he saw a way out. This was their all-in moment. He told her his plan. The town, he reminded her, had been trying to raise funds for years to build a new church steeple, the old one having been struck by lightning. The project had stalled, a symbol of the community's own fractured spirit under the judge's rule. Elias, with his skill, could build that steeple in a matter of weeks. He proposed a daring gamble. They would go before the town council. He would offer to build the steeple, a job worth twice the amount of her debt, in exchange for the town officially forgiving the civic bond and canceling the foreclosure. It was a race against time, a public appeal to the very people who had once watched him on the gallows. It was a chance not just to save their farm, but to unite the community against the judge's tyranny and, in doing so, truly honor the legacy of the sheriff who had built the first bridge. The town hall was packed. Nearly every citizen of Purgatory Peak was there, drawn by the news of the audacious proposal from the town's most unlikely pair. Judge Miller sat at the head of the council table, his face a thunderous mask of fury, confident he could crush this little rebellion. Sarah and Elias stood together before the council, not as a mistress and a servant, but as equal partners. Elias, with a quiet dignity that commanded respect, laid out his plan. He spoke not of his own troubles, but of the town's needs. He spoke of the unfinished church steeple, a symbol of their broken community. He, a master carpenter, offered his skill, his labor, his very hands to heal that break. He offered to build them a steeple that would stand for 100 years, a testament to their faith and unity. All he asked in return was for the town to honor the legacy of its fallen sheriff by forgiving the debt that was being used as a weapon against his widow. Judge Miller immediately attacked the proposal. He called Elias a convicted thief, a man whose work could not be trusted. He called Sarah a foolish woman, whose poor judgment had brought this shame upon them. His voice dripped with legal jargon and righteous indignation, attempting to bully the council into submission. But something had shifted in the town. They had seen Elias's hard work. They had seen Sarah's courage at the gallows. And they had seen the judge's cruelty. One by one, the very people who had once whispered and stared began to stand up. The blacksmith spoke of Elias's skill. The general store owner spoke of Sarah's unwavering honor in paying her bills. Even Dr. Miller, his conscience finally winning out, stood to speak of how Sarah and Elias together had saved the life of a sick child when he had turned his back. The final, powerful testimony came from the preacher. He looked directly at the judge and declared that building a new steeple through an act of grace and forgiveness would be a truer testament to God's will than any punishment the judge could ever devise. The tide had turned. The town council, emboldened by the will of the people, voted unanimously in favor of Elias's proposal. Judge Miller was defeated, not by force, but by the very community he had sought to rule through fear. His power was broken. Sarah's home was safe. And Elias was no longer a condemned man. He was the town's hero. 1 year later, the new church steeple stood tall and proud, a symbol of a community reborn. The farm, now their shared property, was thriving, and the town, led by a new, more compassionate judge, looked upon the Thorne Jenkins household not with suspicion, but with deep admiration. The celebration was not just for the steeple, but for a wedding. In the shadow of the structure he had built, Elias Thorne, now a free and respected man, took Sarah Jenkins as his wife. His 2 children, Caleb and Lily, stood beside him, and Sarah, no longer pregnant, held their newborn baby girl in her arms. 3 children, his 2 and her 1, now bound together as one family. That evening, as they stood on their porch, their 3 children asleep inside, Elias took her hand. He slipped a simple, hand-carved wooden ring onto her finger, a ring he had made to replace the one she had sold for medicine. He told her that on the gallows, he had been ready to die. He had lost his wife, his hope, and his honor. "You gave me back my life that day, Sarah. But these children, and you gave me back my soul. You saved yourself, Elias. You rebuilt this town's spirit with your own 2 hands. You are the furthest thing from a thief. You are the greatest gift this family has ever known." And they knew, as they looked out at the peaceful valley, that they had forged a new life, a new family, proving that the law of compassion is always stronger than the law of vengeance, and that sometimes the most broken souls can come together to build the most beautiful future. If this story of justice and second chances inspired you, click the video on your screen now for another unforgettable tale from the Wild West. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment below. Your support helps us build our community, one story at a time.